Some battles you choose, but others, well, they show up uninvited at your front door with a clipboard and an attitude. I never thought my retirement community would become a war zone, but when the HOA president mocked my autistic son at the community picnic, I knew this was a fight I couldn't walk away from. Before we dive into this story, I want to hear from you. Have you or someone you know ever faced discrimination from an HOA? Share your experience in the comments below. It helps others know they're not alone in these struggles. My name's Jim, and at 62, I'd earned my peaceful retirement. 30 years in the military, followed by a decade as a high school history teacher, had taught me patience, strategy, and when to stand your ground. My wife Sarah and I had moved to Willow Creek Lakeside Community 5 years ago, drawn by the quiet streets, the view of the lake from our backyard, and the promise of respectful neighbors. Our son, Michael, who's 19, lives with us. He's on the autism spectrum, brilliant with computers, but struggles with social cues and sensory processing. When we moved to Willow Creek, we'd been upfront about Michael's needs, and the HOA at the time had been accommodating. That all changed when Brenda Johnson was elected HOA president 2 years ago. Brenda was what you'd call a Karen before the term existed. A woman in her late 50s who'd moved to Willow Creek after a career in corporate middle management. She ruled the HOA with an iron fist and a clipboard that never left her side. She measured grass height with a ruler, cited residents for leaving their garage doors open more than 10 minutes, and once tried to fine a widow for planting the wrong color flowers in her garden. Michael had developed a routine that helped him cope with the world. Every afternoon, he'd take a walk around the lake, stimming by flapping his hands when he was excited or anxious. It was harmless, and most neighbors either didn't notice or simply accepted it as part of who Michael was. But Brenda noticed everything. The trouble started at the annual 4th of July community barbecue. Michael was excited by the fireworks display planned for that evening and was stimming more than usual. As he walked past Brenda's table, she stood up, pointed at him, and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Why is that strange boy flapping around like a wounded bird? Can't his parents teach him some decency?" The picnic area fell silent. Sarah's face went white, and I felt a heat rise from my collar that I hadn't experienced since my days in basic training. I walked over to Michael, put my arm around his shoulders, and guided him away from the crowd. "Dad, why was that lady laughing at me?" Michael asked, his confusion genuine and heartbreaking. "Some people don't understand things that are different from what they're used to, son," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's not your fault." That night, as fireworks lit up the sky over Willow Creek Lake, I made a decision. Brenda Johnson had declared war on my family, and I would fight back with everything I had. You wouldn't believe what she did next. The very next morning, there was a violation notice taped to our front door. "Excessive noise disturbance," it read, citing Michael's erratic hand movements and vocal outbursts as a nuisance to the community. The fine was $100. I called Sarah in from the garden and showed her the notice. "This is harassment," she said, her hands shaking. "It's discrimination," I corrected, "and it's illegal." I spent the rest of that day researching disability rights laws. The Americans with Disabilities Act prohibits discrimination against individuals with disabilities in places of public accommodation. And while HOAs aren't exactly public, they still have to comply with federal housing laws regarding reasonable accommodations. Armed with this knowledge, I requested a meeting with the HOA board. Brenda sat at the head of the table, a smug look on her face, as I explained that Michael's behaviors were part of his autism. and protected under disability laws. "Mr. Henderson," she said, using my last name like it left a bad taste in her mouth, "we're not discriminating against anyone. We're simply enforcing community standards. All residents are expected to conduct themselves in a manner that doesn't disturb their neighbors." "Michael isn't disturbing anyone," I countered. "He's walking around a public area, minding his own business." "Well, his behavior is making other residents uncomfortable," Brenda replied. "Perhaps you should consider finding a more suitable living arrangement for him." The audacity of the suggestion left me speechless for a moment. This woman was telling me to move my son out of his own home because his autism made her uncomfortable. I left that meeting without a resolution, but with a growing determination. That weekend I contacted a lawyer specializing in disability rights cases. She reviewed the HOA bylaws and the violation notices, then smiled. "We've got a case," she said. "A strong one. But these things take time. In the meantime, document everything." And so I did. Every violation notice, every condescending remark from Brenda, every time she followed Michael around the lake with her notebook. I even got a few sympathetic neighbors to write statements about how Brenda had always been overly zealous with her enforcement, but had become particularly hostile toward our family. 3 weeks after the initial incident, Brenda called an emergency HOA meeting, the subject, addressing ongoing disturbances from residents with special needs. You wouldn't believe the gall of this woman. She'd actually put that on the official agenda. The meeting room was packed. Most residents had heard about the picnic incident by now, and opinions were divided. Some supported Brenda's strict enforcement approach, while others were horrified by her treatment of Michael. Brenda opened the meeting by reading from a prepared statement. "The Willow Creek HOA has a responsibility to maintain community standards for all residents. Recent behaviors have disrupted the peaceful enjoyment of our community, and it's time we address these issues directly." She never mentioned Michael by name, but everyone knew who she meant. When she finished, I stood up. "Madam President, you're talking about my son, Michael Henderson, a 19-year-old young man with autism. His behaviors are not a choice. They're part of who he is. And your targeting of him isn't about community standards. It's discrimination, plain and simple." The room erupted in murmurs. Brenda banged her gavel. "Order! We will have order in this meeting." A man I recognized as Dr. Peterson, a retired physician who lived 2 streets over, stood up. "Brenda, with all due respect, this has gone too far. Michael's never hurt anyone. He's never damaged property. He just walks around the lake and flaps his hands when he's excited. How is that harming anyone?" "It's unsettling," Brenda insisted. "It makes people uncomfortable. We have standards here." Another resident, Mrs. Garcia, spoke up. "My grandson has Down syndrome. Are you going to start targeting him next? Where does this end?" The meeting devolved into chaos, with Brenda finally adjourning it without taking any action. As people filed out, several approached me to offer support. "Don't let her get away with this, Jim," said Mr. Henderson. "No relation, but a fellow military retiree. We've got your back." That night I thought we'd won a small victory. The community was divided, but more people seemed to be on our side than Brenda's. I allowed myself a glimmer of hope that perhaps the pressure would be enough to make her back down. I should have known better. The next morning, there were not 1 but 5 violation notices taped to our door. $500 in fines for excessive noise, public disturbance, violating community aesthetic standards, and 2 new ones, operating a business from residence. referring to Michael's computer repair business, which he ran entirely online and brought no clients to our home, and improper storage of hazardous materials, the cleaning supplies for his computer equipment in the garage. Sarah cried when she saw them. "They're trying to drive us out, Jim. What are we going to do?" I gathered the notices, took photos of them on our door, and called my lawyer. "This is war," I told her. "And we're prepared," she replied. "I've drafted a formal complaint to the State Housing Authority, and we're ready to file a federal lawsuit for discrimination and harassment under the ADA and the Fair Housing Act." The legal process moved faster than I expected. Within a week, Brenda received a letter from the State Housing Authority informing her that they were investigating the HOA for discrimination. 2 days after that, she was personally served with lawsuit papers at the HOA office. You should have seen the look on her face when the process server handed her those papers. I wasn't there, but 3 different people described it to me later. She went pale, then red, then started sputtering about how this was all a misunderstanding, how she was just doing her job, how the Hendersons were troublemakers. But the wheels of justice were already turning. What Brenda didn't know was that my lawyer had discovered something interesting during her research. Brenda Johnson had a history of this kind of behavior. At her previous HOA in another state, she'd been removed from the board after multiple complaints of discrimination against residents with disabilities. She'd moved to Willow Creek shortly, after apparently hoping for a fresh start where no one knew her past. That information became part of our lawsuit, along with detailed documentation of every incident, every violation notice, every condescending remark. We had statements from neighbors, copies of emails Brenda had sent to other board members about addressing the Henderson situation, and even audio recordings of some of her more outrageous statements. Thank you, one-party consent state. The false hope came when Brenda called me personally 2 weeks after being served with the lawsuit. "Jim," she said, her voice suddenly warm and friendly, "I think we've gotten off on the wrong foot. Why don't you and I meet for coffee? I'm sure we can work something out that doesn't involve lawyers and courts." I agreed, mostly to see what she would say. We met at a cafe outside the community, and Brenda came armed with what she probably thought was a peace offering. "Look," she said, stirring her coffee nervously, "I'll tear up all those violation notices. I'll even make a public apology at the next HOA meeting. We just need to drop this lawsuit. It's giving the community a bad name." "What about Michael?" I asked. "Is he still going to be unsettling to people? Are you still going to be monitoring his walks around the lake?" Brenda's smile tightened. "Well, we do have community standards to maintain." "And that's the problem, Brenda," I said, standing up. "You don't see Michael as a person with rights. You see him as a problem to be managed. Thanks for the coffee, but we'll see you in court." I thought that would be the end of it, that Brenda would realize she was beaten and back down. I should have known better. People like her don't surrender. They escalate. The very next day, I came home from running errands to find 2 police cars in front of my house. My heart stopped. Had something happened to Sarah, to Michael? I rushed inside to find Sarah sitting at the kitchen table, face pale, with 2 officers standing over her. "Jim, thank God you're home," she said, relief flooding her voice. One of the officers turned to me. "Are you James Henderson?" "I am." "What's going on?" "We received a call about a disturbance at this address," the officer said. "The caller reported that your son was behaving erratically and threatening residents." "Michael's in his room," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "He's been there all afternoon working on his computer. The officers went to check on Michael, who was indeed in his room, completely engrossed in building a new computer. He hadn't been outside all day. "Someone made a false report," I said, anger rising in my throat. "This is harassment," the second officer sighed. "We figured as much. This is the third call we've received about your address in the past week, all reported by the same person, Brenda Johnson." The first officer looked uncomfortable. "Look, we have to respond when we get calls, but, well, let's just say we're getting pretty familiar with Mrs. Johnson's reporting habits." They left after taking a formal statement, but the damage was done. Michael was confused and upset by the police presence. Sarah was shaken, and I was furious. That night, as I lay in bed unable to sleep, I realized this was far from over. Brenda wasn't just going to back down. She was going to fight dirty, and she didn't care who got hurt in the process. The legal battle stretched on for months. There were depositions, document requests, and hearings. Brenda hired an expensive lawyer from the city who tried to argue that the HOA was a private organization and could set whatever rules it wanted. But my lawyer was prepared. She brought in experts on disability law, witnesses who testified about Brenda's pattern of discriminatory behavior, and even a psychologist who explained autism and why Michael's behaviors were not only harmless, but actually beneficial for his well-being. The turning point came when Brenda took the stand during the deposition. Under oath, she was asked directly if she had made negative comments about Michael's autism. "I may have expressed concern about his behavior," she admitted. "Did you refer to him as a strange boy, flapping around like a wounded bird at the community picnic?" my lawyer asked. Brenda hesitated, then nodded. "I might have said something like that, but it wasn't meant to be derogatory." "Did you tell Mr. Henderson that he should consider finding a more suitable living arrangement for his son?" "I suggested that the community might not be the best environment for someone with special needs," Brenda replied, her voice growing tight. "Did you make multiple false reports to law enforcement about the Henderson's son?" "No, I reported genuine disturbances," Brenda insisted, but her face was flushed and she wouldn't make eye contact. My lawyer then presented the police reports, witness statements from officers who acknowledged the calls were unfounded, and phone records showing Brenda had made all the reports. The look on Brenda's face as she realized she'd been caught in a lie under oath was priceless. It was the moment I knew we had her. 2 weeks later, Brenda's lawyer requested a settlement conference. We met in a sterile conference room with a court-appointed mediator, Brenda looking like she hadn't slept in days. Her lawyer trying to project confidence he clearly didn't feel. The settlement offer was generous: complete dismissal of all fines against us, a formal apology from Brenda and the HOA board, mandatory training for all HOA members on disability, rights and reasonable accommodations, and a substantial financial payment to cover our legal fees and compensate for the distress caused. My lawyer and I stepped out of the room to discuss the offer. "It's a good settlement," she said. "We might get more if we go to trial, but there's always uncertainty with a jury." I thought about Michael, who had become anxious and withdrawn during this whole ordeal. I thought about Sarah, who jumped every time the phone rang. I thought about the toll this had taken on our family. "I want one more thing," I told my lawyer. "I want Brenda removed from the HOA board, permanently. And I want it in writing that she can never serve on the board again as long as she lives." "In Willow Creek," my lawyer smiled. "I think we can arrange that." When we returned to the conference room, she presented our counteroffer. Brenda's lawyer tried to negotiate, but Brenda herself finally spoke up. "Fine," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Whatever it takes to make this go away." The settlement was signed that day. The HOA board held a special meeting the following week to formally accept the terms and remove Brenda from her position as president. She didn't attend. The community meeting was packed. The new interim president, Dr. Peterson, read a formal apology to our family. Then he announced that the HOA would be hosting a community education event on understanding and accommodating neighbors with disabilities. After the meeting, dozens of residents came up to shake my hand, hug Sarah, or say a kind word to Michael, who had bravely attended with us. "You did good, Jim," Mr. Henderson told me, clapping me on the shoulder. "You stood up for what's right." As we walked home that night, Michael looked up at me. "Does this mean I can still walk around the lake, Dad?" I put my arm around his shoulders. "You can walk around that lake whenever you want, son. And if anyone gives you trouble about it, they'll have to answer to me." Michael smiled, and for the first time in months it reached his eyes. 3 months have passed since the settlement. Brenda still lives in Willow Creek, but she keeps to herself. I've heard she's put her house on the market, though I don't know if it's true. The new HOA board has implemented disability awareness training and revised their bylaws to explicitly prohibit discrimination. Michael walks around the lake every afternoon, and sometimes other residents join him. Mrs. Garcia's grandson comes over to play video games with Michael, and they've become fast friends. As I sit on my back porch watching the sunset over Willow Creek Lake, I think about the battle we fought and won. It wasn't just about protecting my son. It was about standing up for what's right, about ensuring that people with disabilities are treated with dignity and respect. HOAs can be wonderful organizations that maintain property values and create pleasant communities, but when they're run by people like Brenda Johnson, they can become instruments of harassment and discrimination. The lesson I learned through all this is that you can't always avoid conflict, but you can choose how to respond to it. We responded with patience, documentation, and the law. We fought not with anger, but with facts, and in the end, justice prevailed. Before I sign off, I want to ask you one more question. Should there be federal oversight of HOAs to prevent abuse, like what we experienced? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for listening to our story. Remember to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult. Sometimes the battles worth fighting are the ones you never expected to face. This is Jim Henderson signing off from Willow Creek.